So again, my name is Maurice Cruz. I'm the tribal liaison here in New Mexico for the South Central cast. I hope that you all have enjoyed this morning's Climate 101 presentations so far. We are going to kind of pick up some of those pieces and see how some of the dynamics of weather and climate are playing key factors in what's going on currently with wildfire across the country, as well as what we can expect to see changing as a result of the dynamics and impacts of a changing climate going forward. So before we can begin to start to look at current trends and future expectations, we have to start with a history of fire suppression in the West, because a lot of current conditions are entirely dependent on past policies and practices, starting with the U.S. Forest Service, as well as Western expansion and settlement throughout the country. So some of the earliest declines in the fire regime historically were due to the arrival of cattle and sheep across the West. Grazing on fine fuels, really it caused a sharp decline that's observable in fire reconstructions and fire histories, depleting available fuels that limited the spread and overall frequency of fire in the understory across most mountain ranges in the Western United States. Due to a history of several severe fires in early 1900s, late 1890s, Forest Service instituted pretty severe full suppression policies, one for preservation of the nation's timber resources, as well as to protect life, property, mining, and other industry as well. In 1935, we saw a full nationwide adoption of the 10 a.m. policy, which is basically any fire that was over 10 acres in size was expected to be fully out and cold by the next morning, 10 a.m. typically, because that's when fire activity picks up as day warms, inversions swap, and again, fires tend to grow a lot more. And then starting around 60s and 70s, there was a little bit more of a shift, understanding that maybe some of those practices weren't quite so beneficial for the ecological systems that we had at place. So the National Park Service first, and then following the U.S. Forest Service, began to adopt policies to allow for naturally ignited fires to burn in the backcountry. Here we can see what has historically been the mean fire interval for the United States. You can see that a lot of areas of the West that are dominated by some species like Ponderosa Pine had very frequent fire frequencies, fire-dependent species that really maintained forest health and were integral to the natural landscape as well. And so I wanted to, before we go a little bit further, just kind of point to this report that kind of documents what some of those changes in management policies, as well as agricultural uses of forests have done, and what we can observe directly as an impact of those choices. So this report was funded by the BIA Tribal Resiliency Program on Navajo Nation forests, looking mainly at forest vulnerabilities. We won't go too much into that aspect. I really want to highlight the change in forest density that occurred. Around the 1800s, you can see that there's a pretty sharp increase in overall forest density, stand density that occurred in the higher elevations, mostly in Ponderosa Pine forested areas. But that coincides with the arrival of sheep and cattle to the area. And in the 1900s, you can really see a huge uptick in the forest density that populates the region's forests. Again, that it coincides with full suppression policies at the national level. And now that we kind of have a little bit of understanding that some of these full suppression policies maybe led to increase in stand densities due to the lack of natural removal of biomass from forests, some species were able to take advantage of this and coincided with changes in drought, temperature, annual precipitation. So here we can see up in Wyoming. This is a picture of some beetle kill forests, mostly in lodgepole pine. The mountain pine beetle, for those of you that are familiar with forest health across the West, is really and predominant in what's happened with the decline of healthy forests, and really took advantage again of some of the past management practices that allowed for tree densities to drastically increase compared to historical averages. Took advantage of hot and dry conditions, the lack of fire, as well as densities to really ravage most of these Rocky Mountain forests. Here we can see a map that shows percentage of trees that have some sort of mountain pine beetle damage. And I don't want to focus too much on the West. I know that many of you might not be from New Mexico or California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, but the eastern forests saw many of the same changes, some much more drastic with transition of forested land to farmland, as well as just overall deforestation. But it allowed for many of the same changes in forest composition to occur. One big thing that I would like to highlight is that drought and increase in temperatures have caused boreal forest communities and fire adapted tree species to be replaced by fire sensitive tree species. Because of that, and with expected increase in temperatures, we've seen quite a bit of fire activity. And in fact, the southeastern region of the United States leads the entire country with number of fires, although they don't get quite to the size of most typical large high severity fires out west. They do, again, quite drastically outpace the West in total number of fires. The South also does do a lot more prescribed fire, in which we will get to kind of towards the end of this presentation as well. And this is just highlighting that some of the past changes that we've seen, there's increases in number of freeze-free days, changes in average annual temperatures, really contribute to overall forest health, as well as increasing the length and the total number of days of fire seasons, not only in the Southeast, but to the West as well. Now that we've talked about some of the observed changes that we're seeing, we can talk and move towards what we can expect to see. And unfortunately, as you've probably seen through some of the projections and earlier information today, is that we are expecting increases in temperatures across the West, possible decreases in precipitation depending on the specific region. And all of that kind of points to what we've already seen and is reinforced by what we've seen, especially in places like California in the West, is that the total number of wildfires has drastically increased, and not only the number of fires, but the severity and frequency of these high severity burns that aren't just burning understory, they aren't just burning single trees, they're entire stand replacing fires. This just highlights, again, the changes in annual acres burned. We can see that over the last 20 years or so, we had some changes in variability, but very consistently being close to 10 million acres in the last 5 years alone, each fire season. And along with more active fire seasons, again, comes that increasing cost of wildfire suppression. These show the numbers for the last 20 years, and it's one of those costs that's only going to increase as fire seasons lengthen, fire seasons become more intense, and require more resources to adequately suppress wildfires across the West. 2018 saw over $3 billion being allocated towards fire suppression costs. And for the majority of the last 20 years, over 50% of both federal agencies, most federal agencies' budget has gone towards direct suppression costs. So now we can talk a little bit more about how we can see that these changes in climate, changes in weather, changes in precipitation directly affect current fire seasons, and maybe have a little bit of a discussion about what we think this will have as far as impacts as we see more drastic changes in increase in temperature, longer days without any precipitation, and more significant drought. Unfortunately, this drought monitor is already a little out to date, but you can see that departure from normal temperature coincides with active drought across the United States, as well as the very long periods without any significant or substantial precipitation are quite apparent in California in the West, and particularly Oregon and Washington, in the Sierras and up into the Cascades. Seasonal drought outlook, again, kind of showing either drought persisting or developing. And I think at this point, over 99% of the state of New Mexico, 100% of the state of Colorado are in some form of drought. And so this fire potential outlook kind of shows the progression of fire season from east to west, and seeing that we do have expected continual drought, expected above average temperatures, and unfortunately expected below average precipitation across much of the West. We can see that those impacts directly are directly linked to an increase in significant wildland fire behavior. So we can go through these August through the end of November and see that expected fire behavior kind of follows the pattern of moving first from Southwest region up into the Rocky Mountains, the Great Basin, and across to the Pacific Northwest quadrants. But then as things dry out and we see the return of the fire season to the southeast portion of the United States, and unfortunately, given some of the trends, especially again with increased average annual temperatures, that you can expect to see probably quite active fire season for 2020 in the southeast, as well as across Texas and Oklahoma. And just some food for thought looking forward is, if this is kind of the new normal and the average, what does that mean for resources allocated? So Fire 2000 was quite active year, in particular for the Northern Rockies areas, combined with drought and several dry lightning storms. There were nearly 100 new fires reported every day, 53 days at preparedness level 4. Preparedness levels kind of indicate how many resources are available for certain areas geographically or for the nation at whole. And this was a national PL of 4, so very few available resources for new starts, new incidents. So now I kind of want to go a bit further and talk about what some of those impacts that many of you are probably already aware of that come with fire season, as well as unfortunately how they may be increasing and what that might mean for public health, what that might mean for other resources such as available water resources, as well as what some of the impacts after the fire that might have long-term effects that in the past might have been not as detrimental or as permanent, but now we're seeing issues with landscape conversion post-wildfire that are now coupled with, again, changes in average annual temperature, prolonged periods of drought, and changes in precipitation patterns as well. One of the biggest impacts that almost everyone is probably acutely aware of is air quality suffers quite substantially following wildfires. Even here in New Mexico, we oftentimes get wildfire smoke from California. Oftentimes the Great Basin gets inundated with smoke from California, as well as from Pacific Northwest. Those fine particles not only uncomfortable, but can be detrimental long-term as well, especially for sensitive individuals, the young, elderly, as well as those with asthma and other pre-existing conditions. This is just a picture from up in Idaho in 2017, where unfortunately large active fires basically inundated most of the valleys of Sawtooth Mountain areas, as well as in the Frank Church River. And so this is what every day looked like for about 30 plus days straight in a row. It's kind of hazy, gloomy. And unfortunately, these might be some of the impacts that we are expected to deal with as fire activity increases, not only in intensity, but frequency. This is a map showing air quality for the same area for the same year, about the same time. So the picture was taken before is just about northwest of Boise by about 100 miles or so, right smack in the center of Idaho. So not only are we going to have to deal with the smoke and the fire and the damage directly to forests, but we're also going to have to deal with what some of those long-term impacts might mean for other areas, other resources that we are tasked with managing. So one of the most drastic impacts can be the long-lasting impacts to water supply following post-fire conditions. High-severity standard placing fires not only obviously cause immediate impacts such as sediment loading and particulate runoff, especially when there's high-severity burns occur, causing soil damage. But the loss of timber stands also is shown and has been noticed in loss of snowpack, affecting the timing of when snowmelt and runoff happens, influencing when peak flows happen in lower basins. Not only are we concerned with that, but we're concerned about what does sedimentation and some of the runoff mean for water suppliers. Here in Albuquerque, following some of the large fires in the Jemez area, the water utility had to actually stop diverting surface water in its entirety due to demands it would place on equipment as well as for health and safety reasons. So just some other things to consider about maybe how some of these long-term effects might be increased due to changes in fire activity and behavior. This is showing decreases in the snowpack in the upper Rio Grande Basin. Some of this is mostly attributed to changes in average annual temperature, which has affected how precipitation occurs over the basins. So we've seen about 25 to 1/3 decrease in average annual snowpack over the last 20, 25 years, mainly because we've seen a stark change in precipitation occur. So most of that snowfall that we saw earlier now changes and occurs as rainfall. And so coupling that with the loss of tree cover and timber stands forested areas, we can expect that, unfortunately, again, drastic changes in wildfire regime severity will probably have long-term detrimental impacts to water supply availability and water supply quality as well. Some work that is being done to highlight and to address some of these management issues. The Rio Grande Water Fund here in New Mexico specifically is identifying high-risk watershed areas and doing targeted field treatments to reduce the probability of high-severity wildfires. So continued security of water supply might involve some collaborative efforts between utility managers as well as forest and land managers as well going forward. So just to highlight on the importance of maintaining and reducing catastrophic wildfire risk is that in areas where they have done these targeted treatments, actually seeing increases in snowpack storage and runoff, which also promotes forest resilience and health, as well as able to bounce back from drought-prone areas as well. I'd mentioned the Los Conchas fire just a tiny bit ago, but wanted to dive in a little bit deeper to maybe not just watershed, water quality, water availability issues that we've seen, particularly here in New Mexico, and some of these impacts that are quite large concern to many managers as well as to the tribal folks here in this area, as well as just to a lot of people who are local to these areas and take solace and enjoy natural resources that have to offer. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Los Conchas fire, it occurred in 2011. It burned over 150,000 acres near the town of Los Alamos. And quite a majority of that fire was classified as a high severity burn. In particular, in Santa Clara Canyon, on the tribal lands of Pueblo, Santa Clara, over 50% of their upper watershed was classified as a high severity burn. And so some of you may have seen pictures like these with almost a moonscape looking landscape, high severity, stand replacing, or just absolute catastrophic wildfire. Just all timber in the area is gone. Soil is now hard packed and hydrophobic. And now we're about 8-9 years from the events, and we're starting to see that in the past, reseeding efforts have done quite a bit to restore the landscape to some portion of its former state. But now, compounded with, again, changes in average annual temperature, as well as changes in snowpack and the amount of snow and precipitation we get during the winter, we are seeing start of like landscape scale conversions. Again, just this one kind of highlights again some of the flooding that happened, some of the dynamics that happened with hydrophobic soils, and unfortunately, yeah, the loss of timber, loss of vegetation has contributed to a lot of flooding and erosion in these areas. But back to landscape conversions, we're seeing that these areas that were pretty predominantly ponderosa pine, mixed conifer areas are now coming back as something that looks radically different. And the Forest Service has done massive replanting efforts on the east side of the Jemez, and unfortunately is seeing between 10 to 20% seedling survival rate in areas where we expect a much greater success rate. And so a lot of that is more than likely due to, again, changes in growing conditions for seedlings, changes in average annual temperature, and unfortunately the loss of soil microbes, as well as changes in soil composition that were due to the massive amounts of erosion that happened post-fire. I believe this should play. Emma, if you'll let me know if the audio comes through, that would be great.
If we look at the quandary that we find ourselves in today, these are huge issues for society to grapple with. People are rising up and panicking. They recognize that this can't go on. That's a good thing that that's happening, but it's going to be imperative.
Is there any audio coming through, Emma?
Yes, there is. I was putting my thumb up, but you may not have seen that.
That these people and these movements look for and accept guidance from indigenous people who know how to adapt and respond to a changing environment. Humans have excluded fire from this natural system and have created unnatural conditions as a result. Fire is our relation, and we need to work with fire.
Indigenous people of this country, for a very long time, they've been managing the land using cultural knowledge, using traditional stories, doing prescribed fire, using what they know is good for their places.
At least for the last 1,000 years up to 200 years ago, there was a very intensive Native American fire management regime in place. Fire suppression and exclusion with first colonization, then there was a very strong emphasis on suppressing all fires. And then with increasing climatic conditions of temperatures, drought stress, very dry forest, how does traditional knowledge guide an adaptive process to now learn to live with fire?
The Forest Service is starting to, hear the land screaming back at you. Everything's burning up. Hey, you got to do something. You can't just tell us that we can't do what we've been doing here for a long time, because it's going to mess everything up.
And the more prescribed fire we get on the ground around our communities, the safer we are. elders can still come in here and collect those resources right there, and they can get in here and teach the younger generations the traditional practices, and that knowledge never gets lost.
Fire is many things to us, but it is not our enemy, and we use it. It is a tool.
I think a Western approach has really looked at how we can dictate and control systems. Indigenous or a native approach is how we fit into that system and how we utilize that system. So the two approaches are very, very different.
As far as Indian people, buffalo and all our history, they were, our economy, they were our food, our clothing, then killed to near extinction. These animals here are my passion of bringing these animals back, returning that part of our culture.
You think about the buffalo being the biggest climate change adapter as an animal in the world. A buffalo is so different than a cow, so much more resilient.
Not only are they healthy, for eating, but also for our spirituality and a big part of our culture, or just making us whole again.
Conventional agriculture does everything by mechanics. You have 14-row planters, herbicide applications, pesticide application. A lot of that runs off and contaminates things downstream. With Hopi agriculture, we don't use any of that stuff. Hopi is one of the very few places I know where we plant corn to fit the environment and not manipulate the environment to fit the corn. Dryland farming means that basically you don't use irrigation. These are like super seeds, they're very tough, they're like us, and so they survive like us.
The title of my presentation is Indigenous Agricultural Knowledge, Barriers, Policy, and Integration and Outreach. This corn is rare because you can put it down 2 feet deep and it'll still come up.
We've been in this part of the country for thousands and thousands of years. We know how to manage natural resources.
Agroforestry is far from a new idea, it's actually the old idea. The United States, through the illegal takeover of Hawaii, undermined Hawaii's agricultural capacity. Hawaii moved into this sugarcane monocrop production.
With the old systems where you had more diverse crops, so you've got other crops coming in at different times of the year.
Food forests survive impacts during the Great Storm, where agricultural fields and two-dimensional lines did not.
A lot of our problems with climate change is because we've modified the environment so much. The benefits of this forest is these complete intact elder communities.
Well, the federal government felt that the best way for Menominees to assimilate into the rest of society was to become farmers. The Menominees, being woodland people, their real desire was to keep their land forested. Right now, currently, there's more standing volume of timber on the forest now than there was back in 1854.
We can't operate like the capitalistic society does. It was always the land first.
The fact that we're still here today, in any form, is a testament to adaptation and resilience.
So I wanted to share that, and I know some of those topics are a little bit further reach than maybe some of you were expecting, especially when it comes to food sovereignty and managing bison. But I think it does have some good points that I really would like to highlight. That we have seen a shift in changes in ideology and management practices, especially when it comes to prescribed fire, and it's absolutely incredible. And probably would make people back in the 1900s head spin. But there are many people who have a history with this land, and at this point, their collaboration with federal agencies is just becoming more and more pronounced and beneficial for many, many people, as well as the land itself. And this really just highlights that some of those maybe new practices or old practices, it's great to see a return of some of those actions, as well as own agency and sovereignty expressed by the tribes in terms of managing natural resources. So, sorry about that. The little Zoom bar was hiding my option to go to the next slide. I think some of the key takeaways that I want to leave you with, and that hopefully have built upon some of the presentations from earlier today, is that droughts are not new. Neither are frequent periods of high temperatures, but in combination with the two, as well as the result of past management practices, high severity wildfires are becoming more frequent and sometimes more devastating in terms of cost to human life, as well as lasting impacts to the forested landscapes. Expected operating costs, again, are going to increase quite substantially if this trend continues. And landscape conversions post-fire are becoming more and more frequently areas of concern, and unfortunately, those are now starting to provide their own unique challenges, trying to deal with, well, do we assist that landscape conversion to a slightly more beneficial state? Do we do everything we can to keep it as is and as is preferred? Or is there some sort of new state that might be even more beneficial as well? Some of those other issues that, again, I would hope that you come away with is that wildfire does not just affect the forest, wildland-urban interface, or air quality, but also can affect other areas of resource priorities, such as drinking water supplies as well. And hopefully this has you thinking a little bit about how some of these complex issues might start requiring more collaboration with other agencies or with folks who might be traditional to the land based on where you work and where you manage resources for benefits to all parties involved. So with that, I think I am at the end. Just a few works cited. Are there any questions?